SCI, the Committee for Scientific Investigation. And if I could just acknowledge our fellow people that are on the board responsible for running the group. We have Bob Glickman over here, Becky, Tom Napier, Dr. Dave Langdon, and Dr. David Cattell, who also thanked for being the physics department chair in our connection to the Community College of Philadelphia, who's nice enough to have us. I think also missed David Cregan in the back. And just to jump ahead, he'll be our speaker along with Faye Flam, who's over here on the subject of fear and foods. That will be for the Philadelphia Science Festival in April. A location will be announced. Also concerning Faye, who's been a science writer for many years and a blogger on science, a book writer. She now has a new column coming out for Forbes, which will be found at Forbes/sites/Faye Flam. Other events that our group does, in Saturday, October 18th, in this very same room, we'll have a lecture on the end of the world, again, by Professor Barry Backer. Then in November, our last meeting since we call the school year, will be a lecture on the perils and potential of brain science. Given there's new ways that our brain can be scanned, there's all kinds of fascinating ethical issues that something to be scared of. And then in January next year, we'll start up again. And in April is our science festival. In May, we'll have a field trip to the Pinelands to investigate where there's sightings of ghosts and monsters and whatnot. And then we're off for the summer, except for in June when we'll have our picnic. For people that haven't joined already, you can talk to Deriva, who's also on our board over there, and our treasurer. She happily takes donations and membership dues, and also our publication here, found where students should have signed up, by the way, over there with other free information. This is published 4 times a year. Feel free to submit articles, and our editor is Ray Cowell. Are there any other announcements I might have missed? Okay, in that case, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Dr. Paul Brewer from the University of Delaware, who teaches political science and other subjects, and he'll be talking on the important subject of science and the media. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul. But first, you get this gift bag right here, and if you could just hold up this other gift that we got you related to your subject today. Hopefully people recognize the title of today's talk. Back off, man, I'm a scientist.
If you don't recognize it, we'll get into that.
Yeah, I'll tell you all about this. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for coming. Help yourselves to more of our science take there.
Thank you for having me here today. And before I start, I'd like to thank the students who took my courses at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the University of Delaware, who helped conduct some of the research that I'm going to be talking about here today. I'm new to this system, so if there's issues, and I'm going to be playing some video clips in addition to talking. So how's the volume right now?
Good.
Okay, great. If it isn't great at some point, let me know. I'd also like to thank a special guest here today. My mother is in town in Newark, Delaware, visiting from Kentucky, my home state, and she helped instill a spirit of skeptical inquiry in me at an early age. So without her, I wouldn't be here today. And more just than one.
A terrible mother.
Now, so the quote that's the title of my talk, "Back Off, Man, I'm a Scientist," comes from the movie Ghostbusters, as we'll see. Show of hands, how many of you have seen Ghostbusters? All right, so pretty popular movie. It's shocking to me that it is 30 years old this year. It was one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid. In my mind, when I was a kid, Dr. Peter Venkman was the second coolest person in the world after Indiana Jones. He's still pretty cool. And I wanted to start with a clip from Ghostbusters, which helps explain how I ended up as a professor. So I'm a professor of communication and political science, and a lot of what I do has to do with public opinion about politics. But in the past 5 to 10 years, I've gotten interested in science communication as well. And I've always been interested in the subject area that I'm going to be talking about. Ghostbusters played a role in that. Ghostbusters also helped, I think, inspire me to become a professor. Now, a lot of people would watch Ghostbusters and think, oh, wow, I want to go out and be a Ghostbuster and have their proton packs and everything. But I always remembered this line of dialogue from Ray Stantz, which helped push me towards a career in academia.
Personally, I like the university. They gave us money and facilities. We didn't have to produce anything. You've never been out of college. You don't know what it's like out there. I've worked in the private sector. They expect results.
All right, so a little tongue-in-cheek, but I do like it in academia. If you don't know in the movie, they get kicked out of Columbia in the first 10 minutes of the movie, and that's why they go into business as Ghostbusters. So today I'm going to be talking about what the public believes about paranormal topics like ghosts and haunted houses and extrasensory perception, and what role the media might have in influencing public beliefs about the paranormal. Let me start with the results of a poll. So there's not a lot of public polling information about what the public believes regarding the paranormal, but what there is pretty consistent in showing that a large percentage of the public, not a majority, but a large percentage of the public, believes in all sorts of different paranormal phenomena. So these are results from a 2005 Gallup poll, showing the percentage of people believing in ghosts was 32%. About a third of the public. Haunted houses, 37%. And then ESP, 41% of the public. So a lot of people tell pollsters that they believe in a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. Where do those beliefs come from? Well, one suspect that people point to is media influence. Now, there actually hasn't been a lot of research on whether the media influence people's beliefs in the paranormal. What little there is largely been done by a Purdue professor by the name of Glenn Sparks with various colleagues. And so back in the 90s, he did a number of studies. You might remember in the 90s, there was kind of a paranormal boom, especially around UFOs. And so he was inspired by that to study so he used a series of experiments to test whether watching paranormal-themed media influenced belief in the paranormal. So he found, for example, that watching a TV program about the paranormal increased belief in the paranormal phenomena, except when that program was presented with a disclaimer. Likewise, reading a news story about UFOs, with the scientists saying stuff suggesting that UFOs exist, made readers more likely to believe in UFOs, unless it also had a scientist disconfirming UFOs. And he did another study with a TV news story. Similar results. So that was done back in the 90s. Not a lot of research since then on the topic, and I decided to take a look at it. And one thing I was particularly interested in, and I'll explain why as we go along, is the specific role of scientific authority in media messages. That is, does having the aura, the trappings of being a scientist, influence, if those are in a message about the paranormal, does that help shape belief in the paranormal? Whether these messages come with the aura of scientific authority. And that's where the title comes from.
What has that got to do with it? Back off, man. I'm a scientist.
So the Ghostbusters present themselves as scientific authorities. And they're using that to bolster their credibility. And so, again, what I'm interested in is the extent to which media messages that invoke this kind of scientific authority influence public beliefs about the paranormal. So I did 2 studies. And the first one deals, not surprisingly, with ghosts. So back to the movie Ghostbusters, remember they have all kinds of cool tools. And this clip illustrates one of them. I don't even know what you would call this, but it's scientific.
It's here.
A full torso apparition, and it's real.
So what do we do? Could you come over here and talk to me for a second, please? Could you just come over here for a second, please? Right over there.
Come here, Francine. Come here.
I'm Peter. Where are you from? Originally.
So notice what they've got there. They've got the thing with the glowing lights. They've got the cameras. They've got their own little technical jargon like full torso apparitions. So Ghostbusters, fictional movie, but do these features of how they go about looking for ghosts remind you of anything that's not 30 years old? How about people that you can see on the Sci-Fi Channel in shows like Ghost Hunters. So here's a clip for those of you who haven't seen Ghost Hunters. Sci-Fi has a series and a number of other series. Here's just a brief clip to give you a taste of what they do.
Mr. Wickwire, there's a lot of activity that happens here when Michelle is alone, and she is concerned for her safety. Do you mean her any harm? Temperature's going down. What the hell was that? Whoa. It's shuffling sounds. More movement.
Okay, we've got a definite pocket of energy over there.
Oh my God, it's like freaking out. The static pod is like jacked. Yeah.
All right, so they've got their own technical lingo. This is the Atlanta Paranormal Society. They've got their own devices. The difference between these guys versus Ray, Winston, Egon, and Peter is that they present themselves as real. And so, a little background here. I'm going to oversimplify some history of paranormal investigations. Because for a long, long time, people looking for ghosts have styled themselves as being scientific. But you can kind of think of two traditions here. The older one being what I'm going to call the spiritualist tradition. So, around the turn of the 1900s, mediums were really popular. And this is where people start talking about ectoplasm. And so, for over 100 years, people have been using this tradition to try to communicate with the other side. But what's going on right now is the popularity of quote-unquote scientific paranormal investigators. So in 2004, the Sci-Fi Channel launched Ghost Hunters. And it was such a rating success that they launched spin-offs like Paranormal State, and other networks got into the act too and made their own paranormal themed shows. Even ones about pets, ones about celebrities. So all kinds of media messages out there on TV about the paranormal. And then these are covered in Entertainment Weekly and newspapers. And in a case of life imitating TV, lots of people get excited about this and they launch their own paranormal investigation societies. Like where I'm from, Delaware, not a big state, but they have their own paranormal investigation society. And back to this key concept of scientific authority, they have all kinds of technology, the people on TV and the people in real life. They have, and I noticed when I was looking at the newsletter that this is going to be this stuff is very familiar to some of you because you had your own ghostbusting expedition this summer, where you had cameras to detect orbs, and you had infrared thermometers, a ghost meter, an EMF sensor, and so these are the tools of the trade that the contemporary scientific paranormal investigator uses. And they also have their own language. They talk about hotspots and EVPs, electronic voice phenomena. So it's presented in a way that leads the viewer to think, this is a scientific enterprise. And so what I was especially interested in was how these kinds of messages influence belief in the paranormal. And so I'm not going to go through, this is all technical lingo, basically testing for three things here. One is being exposed to a story about paranormal investigators that presents them with these trappings of science, the jargon, the devices. If you're exposed to that message, are you going to be more likely to believe in ghosts and haunted houses and to believe that paranormal investigators are scientific compared to someone who isn't exposed to that message? So that's the first thing we're looking for. The second thing we're looking for, is it any kind of message about investigating the paranormal, or do these trappings of science, the jargon, the devices, do they make a difference themselves? So here, what we're interested in is, let's compare a message about a paranormal investigator that invokes these trappings of science, the scientific authority, compared to a message that's also about paranormal investigators, but draws on this older spiritualist tradition, talking about mediums and things that go bump in the night. And then the third hypothesis we're interested in just rebutting this claim, this kind of grab at scientific authority. If you bring in a scientist who says this isn't actually scientific, does that undermine the impact of these trappings of science that paranormal investigators are using? Well, to do this, to study this, we conducted a randomized experiment. So we got 520 people to take part in the study. And these 520 people is about evenly split between college students and non-students. And these 520 people, we asked them to read a couple stories. The first one was about an unrelated topic. And it was there just to throw people off as to what the real purpose of the study is. The second one was what we call the treatment story. And we manipulated the content of that second story. So there were 4 different versions of the second story. And these 520 participants were randomly assigned to read one of those 4 versions. The first one was the control condition. The people in this condition read a story that didn't have anything to do with paranormal investigations. So they're the baseline. The second group read a story, and this is based on a real story in Washington Post magazine, about a paranormal investigator, and it talked about how he used EMF detectors and infrared thermometers, and it had him use all of this jargon and lingo. The third story was drawn from the same article, but we edited it differently. So the original article was really long, multiple pages. We edited it down to a pretty short story. And we edited it selectively. So in the second version of it, instead of talking about the EMF detectors and infrared thermometers, he's talking about how he was training to become a medium, and how he grew up in a house where there were unexplained phenomena, where there were things that wouldn't bump in the night. And the fourth version, it was exactly the same as this version, except there are a couple paragraphs at the end where the reporter interviewed a professor in South Carolina who said, this isn't science. This is pseudoscience. And after the participants had read whatever story they were assigned to read, we gave them a survey. And the survey had all kinds of questions. Some of them were about completely unrelated topics. The key questions were questions asking them whether they thought the paranormal investigators were scientific. And questions asking whether they believed in ghosts and haunted houses. So what we're interested in was, does which story they were randomly assigned to read influence how they answer these questions? So now, that's what I'm going to show. So here are the results. First, those are the averages in the control condition. So this, again, is the baseline. These people didn't read any story about paranormal investigators. Let's compare them to the people who read the version presenting paranormal investigators as scientific. And what we see is belief in ghosts and haunted houses went up, and belief in paranormal investigators as scientific went up. And these differences, if we do a test of statistical significance, are statistically significant. Now let's compare these people to the people who read the version that emphasized the spiritualist angle. So was it any story about the paranormal, or was it specifically stories that emphasized the science? And there's a big difference. So the people who read the spiritualist story look virtually identical to the people in the control condition. Reading the spiritualist story didn't increase their belief in the scientific credibility of paranormal investigators. It didn't increase their belief in ghosts or haunted houses. Now let's look at what happened when people read the scientific story, but they got that rebuttal at the end. And it turns out that the rebuttal does away with the impact of the scientific authority, the scientific trappings. So compared to this condition, these folks were less likely to believe in ghosts and haunted houses and less likely to see paranormal investigators as scientific. Really, if you look at this, and the people who stand out are the people who read the version presenting paranormal investigators as scientific. So what does this all mean? Well, the first conclusion we drew was this evidence suggests that the trappings of science matter. That media messages that invoke these tools of scientific authority can sway people's beliefs about the paranormal. But not just any message matters. Just talking about paranormal investigators wasn't enough to make people believe in ghosts and haunted houses more. There's only a specific kind of message that did so. And then what scientific authority can give, it can also take away. If you quote a scientist rebutting this, saying it's not science, then that neutralizes the effects of these trappings of science. Okay, so that's the study. I'll talk a little bit about the aftermath of the study. So, University of Delaware, like lots of universities, has an Office of Communication and Marketing. And so I thought they might be interested in this. Might release this to the media, see if we can get a little publicity. And so we put together a press release, and we're really strategic about it. And we timed it for right before Halloween 2012. And it worked. I got calls from reporters. They were interested in interviewing about this. Even last year, in 2013, Halloween came around again, and I got a call from the real estate reporter from the Wall Street Journal. He was doing a story about whether rumors about a house being haunted would affect its real estate value. So I'm curious to see if the reporters come back again this Halloween. Now, can you guess what reporters' favorite question was when they were interviewing me about this study? Yes, exactly. That was the most common question that I got. Do you believe in ghosts? But they did ask other questions. So there are a variety of reactions to the study. Some internet sources I'd never even heard of before. So one of them was, it got covered in a website called Giant Freaking Robot. And their summary, much more pithy version than I gave you. Complex machining words makes ghost hunters seem less bullshit. So that was one sort of reaction. This got picked up by some skeptical websites and forums. And also got some reactions from believers. And this was my favorite example. So there's a science newswire called Live Science. And so it picked up the story, and then this website, MWO Truth, linked to it and said, it's rather complicated. I have to think about it just to get it in my head. There's something that's playfully absurd in a popular science blurb, that's livescience.com, using scientific jargon, that's the details of my study, seeking to influence public opinion by citing a professor, that's me, on a study he conducted looking at popular media, using scientific jargon to influence public opinion, and how citing a professor can mitigate that influence. And I read that, I thought, once I got it, I was like, yeah, fair enough. So that was the first study. So given that, we liked how that study went, decided to do another one. And so the topic we chose for this was ESP. Now, ESP is not the focus of the movie Ghostbusters, but you might remember there's a scene in the beginning where Dr. Venkman is doing a little of the classic stereotypical ESP research. He has an ulterior motive here, too, as you might remember.
Think hard. What is it? Circle. Close. Front, yep. Right?
Okay, so there's a long tradition of ESP studies using those cards and so forth. But what inspired me, besides this being in Ghostbusters, to look at ESP was, how many of you have heard of Daryl Bem? Daryl Bem. B-E-M. Yes. Yes. So, very famous psychologist. Very heavily cited. So, a while back, Bem was in the news for his research on ESP. So, this is a story from Broadcast TV News. Now, not a lot of psychological research gets picked up in the national news, especially on primetime, evening broadcast television news. So here's what the story had to say about it.
Sometimes we all think we have a sixth sense, but tonight something new. Is there proof of ESP? Sharon Alfonso reports.
Daryl Bem often wows friends with his card tricks, using magic to identify a card pulled from a deck.
Ace of Hearts.
You remember that? Okay. Actually, you're very good at that.
But Bam also happens to be one of the most respected psychologists in the country, and he started to wonder, do some people really have an extra sense? Can they predict things? Does ESP exist? He decided to look into it.
Okay, so Bim did some studies and he published the results. I'm also going to show you another clip. So Bim got a lot of coverage for this. A little bit more background in just a second. But it also got covered on the Colbert Report. Now, Stephen Colbert, being a comedian, focused on one particular angle of Bim's studies, which was the studies involved college students trying to predict images that they were going to be shown, and the results where he found, where he argued there's evidence for ESP, revolved around erotic imagery. So Stephen Colbert, this is we're picking it up, and so he did about a 2 or 3 minute story where he talked about how Bim had discovered what seemed to be extrasensory pornception.
I just wish Professor Bem were here to explain it to me. Wait, I'm sensing a presence. Yes, joining me now, Professor Daryl Bem. Professor, thank you so much. Professor. Thank you for going to have spoken to me. You will have been a great guest. Now, how is this working? How is this working that these waves of influence are coming from the future to show us? The naughty parts.
We have no idea.
Thank you so much for joining us. I guess what made you think to even try this? Did you just have college students and you thought, what can I show them that would raise eyebrows?
No, the belief that the future can be detected goes all the way back to the Old Testament.
Well, of course.
And about 60% of Americans believe that there are people who do this.
Right.
And most psychologists say it's nonsense, like Ray Hyman.
Right.
And so it intrigued me to show in the laboratory whether we could actually find it in just unselected people.
But did you really show anything? It's 53%. That's not that big of a difference from 50%. How do you know you're actually demonstrating something with that?
Well, 53% sounds small,
Yes.
but that's exactly the amount that a casino has over you in a roulette wheel.
It's a 53% advantage.
Yes, over you win 47% of the time, and they win 53% of the time in a roulette wheel. 53% is what Obama won over McCain in the presidential election.
Wait a second. Are you saying that Obama is a time-traveling pornographer? That's why he won't show us the birth certificate.
Perhaps.
Because the date is from the future.
Right? What it tells us is people didn't just go into the booth and flip a coin, because that 53% is actually quite large. It's also the size of the Colbert bump. Candidates who appear on this program have a 3% advantage over those who do not.
Really?
Yes. So 3% is...
3% is the Colbert bump?
And
If you show me some pornography, it might get bigger.
All right, so like I said, not a lot of psychological studies get this level of media coverage. So Bim published his research in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It's actually one of the most prominent, prestigious social psychology journals out there. Now, as you might imagine, a lot of psychologists push back against this. So JPSP published a rebuttal from critics of Bim, and they also, both sides talked to reporters, and so there's a fair amount of media coverage on TV, also in print. And I looked at this coverage, and some of it was what I call one-sided. So it just talked about Bim and it presented his findings. But other coverage was two-sided. So it talked about Bim and his findings, and then it interviewed his critics. It included rebuttals. And then there's a third pattern, which talked about Bim's findings, but used it as an opportunity, to make some ESP-related humor, kind of like Colbert did. And one thing I noticed that interested me was the New York Times ran a story about this. So it's the same story, and in the original edition in the New York Times, the title of the story, the headline was ESP paper expected to outrage psychologists. But what happens in newspapers sometimes, especially New York Times and other leading newspapers, is their stories get picked up by other newspapers. And so another newspaper picked up this story, and the text of the story was the same, but the title is different. They renamed it, "You May Already Know This," making a little ESP joke at the expense of the research. And what I was interested in here is following up on the last finding from the original study, the idea that scientific rebuttals can undermine arguments for the existence of paranormal phenomena that rely on scientific authority. So instead of just talking about the media building scientific authority, how can the media destroy scientific authority? And so once again, we were testing three different things. One was the effects of a story about BIM's research with no rebuttal compared to people who didn't read that story. Second was much like another test in the original study. What's the impact of reading the story about BIM's research versus reading a story about BIM's research that also includes a rebuttal from a scientist? But the third one that we tested, the third hypothesis, was something new. What's the impact of reading a story about BIM's research that makes light of it and treats it as a joke? Or another way to put it is, what's the best way to undermine the scientific authority of paranormal research? Is it by rebutting the science, or is it by making fun of it? Once again, so it's based on a randomized experiment, 446. These are all college students this time. And you might think, well, that's a problem. And certainly it's not a representative sample of the public. But one of the interesting things about public belief in ESP is it's the one form I know of public belief in paranormal phenomena that doesn't depend on level of education. People with a college education are just as likely to believe in ESP as people who don't have a college education. So people in this study read three stories, one of which was the one that we were actually interested in, one of which was the one that we manipulated the content. And there are four different conditions. The control condition. These people were randomly assigned to read a story on a completely unrelated topic. Second condition, read a one-sided story about BIM's research. And this was actually an edited version of the New York Times story that I was talking about earlier. So one version we created just talked about BIM's research, but another version talked about BIM's research, but included, remember BIM was talking about Ray Hyman? Ray Hyman is probably BIM's most prominent critic. So the two-sided version not only had BIM talking, but also had some quotes from Ray Hyman, saying that this was unscientific research, that BIM's conclusions were erroneous, that there was arguing about the science behind BIM's research, saying it wasn't sound science. But the fourth version, it started off the same, talking about BIM's findings, and it has the same critic, Ray Hyman. But this time, we use quotes from Hyman where he's saying things like, I suspect that this may all be an elaborate hoax on BIM's part. And it talks about BIM's history of being a stage magician. And it uses that headline, you may already know this, whereas the two-sided one uses study expected to outrage psychologists. And we did a post-test with belief measures. People did a survey. We asked them, do you believe that ESP research is scientific? And do you believe in ESP or extrasensory perception? And here are the results. So there's the control condition. You might notice belief in ESP is pretty high towards the top of the scale. That scale would actually go up to 5, so it's around the middle between belief and disbelief. People who get the one-sided version, which just presents BIM and his findings, more likely to believe in ESP, and to believe that ESP research is scientific. But when we throw in the lines from Ray Hyman rebutting BIM science, belief goes down. And the same thing happens when we throw in quotes from Ray Hyman in the headline, treating us all as one big joke. So it turns out, once again, scientific authority matters. So BIM, when he's presented as this prestigious researcher and psychologist, and when that's the only part of the story that people get, they're more likely to believe in ESP and think that ESP research is scientifically credible. But Again, scientific authority can take away as well as give. A rebuttal neutralizes that impact. But treating paranormal as a joke also works just as well as a scientific rebuttal. So kind of two different paths to challenging arguments about paranormal research being scientific. So where do we go from here? I haven't done any more research on this, but there are certainly topics that you could look at. So another popular theme in paranormal research or related research is cryptids, cryptozoology, and I think you all had a talk about that a while back. So there are TV shows about this, like Finding Bigfoot. There's also astrology. So public opinion polls show that a substantial percentage of the public believes that astrology has a basis in science. So where does that belief come from? Again, we could look at the role of the media in influencing that. We can study other media. The media that we actually manipulated, it's easy to manipulate the content of print stories. It's not necessarily as exciting as testing the impact of, say, the Colbert Report or watching an episode of Ghost Hunters. So that would be a logical next step. The studies that we did were fairly simple. We're just testing, does it influence people's beliefs or not? I think it'd be interesting to delve a little bit more into what's the psychology behind this media influence. And we just studied what people said in survey questions. But these kinds of media messages could also influence whether people talk about and how they talk about the paranormal, or even whether they get personally involved in paranormal research. In terms of what this all means, I said there's not that much research on the media influence on paranormal beliefs. What there is dominated by a skeptical perspective. So kind of the key assumptions there are public beliefs in the paranormal are a problem. It's not a great thing that such a sizable percentage of the public believes in the paranormal, and blames the media as contributing to these problematic beliefs. So this is the kind of perspective you'll see in the magazine Skeptical Inquirer, where the second study was published. And so if you view media influence and public belief in the paranormal from this lens, I think there's good news, bad news in our study. On the one hand, some findings could be seen as troubling, because if ghost hunters and ESP researchers dress themselves up as scientists and get the media to present them that way, that seems like it could influence belief in the paranormal. On the other hand, some findings could be reassuring. If scientists get critical voices out there about this research, then that can undermine the efforts of paranormal investigators to claim the mantle of science. Now, you can also bring alternative views to this. From the perspective of believers, it's the same implications, just the good and the bad are reversed. If you believe in the paranormal, you can get your message out there by presenting it as scientific, but other scientists can come along and undermine it. And I'm not really going to get into this, but I think there's some interesting research by some professors down in Texas. They have a book called Paranormal America, which I think is really interesting. And they're interested not so much in media influence or whether the paranormal is real or not, but what kinds of people believe in the paranormal. Is belief in the paranormal abnormal or normal? But that is where I'm going to leave things so that we can have time for questions and comments.
I assume it's purely coincidental that BEM is the old sci-fi acronym for bug-eyed monster.
I'm sure that's been pointed out to him before. Yes.
Polls. Which polls? Cross-cultural polls. We've got Gallup, American. Europeans have a different political economic system. They're less religious than we are. And if we take our way of seeing the world, it's a lot of religious beliefs. So that's an umbrella to begin with, and I'm sure that that would enter into the statistics that you get on that poll. And the other thing is the authority figures. In the 30s and 40s, you had doctors promoting Camel cigarettes. So many doctors prefer Camels. And so that influenced and kept the cigarette industry going. Okay, my last thing is Ghostbusters had Harold Ramis as one of the characters. Okay, here you've got the jokey part, so it reinforces, okay, we're joking about it, but we still believe it, and it's pushing it. Whereas SCTV also used Harold Raymer, and they satirized the whole ghost business, Xantar, Michael Flaherty, and so forth. So it's a different, and they used America for the fodder for their satire.
Interesting. So I'm more familiar with Ghostbusters than SCTV. I do remember SCTV. Quick reactions to all three of those points. So the polls that I showed were Gallup polls done in the United States. However, I have seen some polling in the United Kingdom, and I think Canada as well, with fairly comparable levels of beliefs in ghosts and haunted houses. Now, beyond those Anglophone countries, I haven't seen any poll results. I'd be very curious to. On the second point, this broader scientific authority. Obviously, our studies weren't the first ones to look at the broader role of scientific authority. In fact, there's this big literature in the field of science communication that looks at all the different ways that scientific authority is used and can be used and influences the public. So we were drawing on that body of literature and saying, well, no one's really applied this to the paranormal. And then the third, now, when talking about the effects of media messages, we focused on news stories. But I would be curious to see the potential effects of more humorous messages, because I watch Ghostbusters and think, okay, they're obviously poking fun at these tools that they're using. But not every audience member takes away the same interpretations of media messages. I showed clips from Stephen Colbert. Not everybody interprets Colbert's humor the same way. So Colbert is satirizing a right-wing talk show host, but some conservatives, and there have been studies on this, believe that Colbert is agreeing with their point of view. So the intent of the message and the interpretation of the message aren't always the same thing. So that would be interesting to study as well. Yes?
I see a lot of distinct parallels in the brain believing whatever it shall believe, non-critically. Paranormal activities, it could be based on religious, supernatural experiences which are thrown at us through the media every Sunday from sunup to sundown. There's a variety of media-produced things that are really shoved down our throat, and a high percentage of these things get believed by the brain for whatever reason. I haven't read The Believing Brain yet, which is a book that's on my list here to read, that's in our Factum newsletter this month. I'd like to find out just why we are so susceptible to such fallacies, such obvious fallacies, and what connection the media has in perpetuating.
Yeah, so that's a big question, and I think there are lots of parts of the answer to that. I'll just give one, which reflects some of the study I've done in more cognitive aspects of social psychology, which is that the world is a very complex place, and we're constantly bombarded with information.
Right.
And to critically evaluate information takes cognitive energy.
Sure.
And we can't always be using that cognitive energy. So we see advertisements on television and we think, I know they're trying to sell me stuff, so that doesn't influence me. But they don't influence you by consciously persuading you. They influence you by drilling the same message over and over again. And when you're not thinking hard about it, but you receive the message, is when it influences you the most. You use shortcuts, you think heuristically. Mm-hmm. And if you're not paying hard attention, this person sounds like a scientist. They have doctor in front of their name, they're wearing a lab coat, so they must know what they're talking about. Now, if you thought hard about it, then you might not be influenced. But most of the time, we're not thinking hard about it.
So it's kind of a form of critical laziness.
Yeah.
I think you asked the question earlier, is what the psychology is behind these beliefs. I think my answer to this question is that it stems from our nature. And specifically, we are essentially cause and pattern-seeking animals. And towards that, we apply the mechanism of inductive reasoning. And in inductive reasoning, whenever there's a gap which appears, we just bridge it with the supernatural. The scientist, rather than doing that, he figures there's a gap there, I'm going to research and try and bridge it. And that happens very often. All these miracles of the past now are no longer miracles. However, if you talk about religion, bridging gaps in religion, I think you will find that even scientists are willing to bridge that gap with the supernatural. Because it's somehow built into our, again, cause. Every time there's an effect, we need, it's our safety. What the hell caused that? Was that a door opening, or I heard something? And we yearn to match things up and cause and effect, and to do that, we seek patterns.
Yeah.
Deductive reasoning gives us those patterns.
I think one of the kind of mechanisms of that, which I think contributes to the belief in the paranormal, is spurious correlation. So we see things happening at the same time, and also selective memory. Let's say I have, we all have many dreams a night. We don't remember many of them, we remember some of them. And let's say every now and then, something that happens in one of our dreams, something like that happens later on. We remember that because, it's unusual. There's this correspondence. All the other dreams that never come true in any sense, we forget. So they're de-emphasized in our memory. Yes?
Carrying along the Lou's thought, we're trying to explain all the phenomena we come across, and one of the first phenomena is ourselves. We meet it in the crib. And how does this thing operate? And I would say we come up with a paranormal answer to that. That there's a strong explanation. I've just been studying Nietzsche on this subject, but it's right up to date, and that is that it is a cascade of causality, and then you apply an explanation to it. Even yourself, even my waving my hand as I talk, is supplied in response to things that happened long ago, and I'm just watching them happen. However, I own it, so it's me anyway.
Hey. I had a specific question about the second study that you did, the third hypothesis part. Now, the second part was with the rebuttal with an expert, like expert rebuttal. The second part, you used the same expert, but sort of more in a humorous light. So I'm wondering, did you tell them that this was an expert, or did you make them believe that this was just some non-expert, just happened to be using humor? Because I feel like you might have some sort of crosstalk where maybe it wasn't the humor, maybe it was still the fact that he was an expert, and it didn't matter what he was saying, it was just that he was an expert.
Yes, so the expert's the same, and we presented his same credentials. So the credentials are a key part of the scientific authority. So, Ray Hyman, he's a psychology professor, I think at the University of Oregon, so that all was in there.
Because I'm wondering, what if you had used, say, like Stephen Colbert, poking fun at it, then you would really see if it was just the humor that was making them, just making fun of it, that was making them not believe it, as opposed to an expert using humor to...
Yes, that's a fine distinction, but I think an important one. So we're using a credible scientific source using humor to rebut a paranormal argument. That would be an interesting follow-up study. Is it the scientific authority, the rebutter, or is it kind of the humorous content?
Yeah.
We can't say that from our study.
Does including a rebuttal lower trust in scientific authority in general? That would be a fourth hypothesis.
Yes, we actually asked about that, and I think I looked at that, and there wasn't any evidence that it influenced overall
You
belief
show
in
that
scientists.
scientists can disagree, or that,
Yes.
or even worse, that somebody's criticizing something and saying this isn't scientific.
Yeah, which is we include those questions because there's a concern in the scientific community if you kind of get in the ditch and argue with people that you see as having an unscientific viewpoint, that you bring science down in general. So we looked at that, and because it's a null result, we didn't really focus on it in the study, but I was interested to see if that was the case. And I'm pretty sure that there was no effect on overall trust in scientists. Yeah.
Two questions. First of all, going back to your point about the polls, you mentioned you saw polls in the U.S., or you used American polls, and you saw polls in Canada, in the United Kingdom. One of the things I'm curious about, particularly, is whether or not there are differences in belief in paranormal phenomenon as you go from place to place in the United States. Because as you know, like people in the South do tend to be much more religious than people in the North, and so on and so forth. The second question that I have in mind was, could you use these results and see them as a double-ended sword? For instance, if you think about the quote-unquote debate with intelligent design in the evolution community, you'll see a handful of experts that have scientific credentials, and some even teach, and you'll often see them then used as rebuttal in order to undermine scientific claims with pseudoscientific claims, and that's an interesting. Considering that is an interesting possibility, and how one would go about. How one goes about both using science as a means of undermining pseudoscience and keeps pseudoscience from successfully undermining science.
Yeah, good points, both of those. The first one, I mentioned that book at the end, Paranormal America. So my research is more about testing the effects of specific media messages. Their book is more about kind of looking at the sociology of belief in the paranormal. So that's if you're interested in that topic, that's a really good resource, because what they're trying to do in that book is look at kind of the demographic characteristics of people who believe and don't believe in the paranormal. And they did some survey research. They also did some participant observation research where they went out into the field with Bigfoot hunters and things like that. So it makes a really interesting read. On the second point, I teach a course on science communication, and this past week we've been talking about media coverage of intelligent design. And I think, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're wondering if kind of my findings can be flipped on their head.
Right.
If people with the trappings of science can use their perceived scientific authority to undermine the dominant scientific consensus. And one example there is the prominent role of Michael Behe, who's a biology professor at Lehigh University. So if you look back in the Dover, PA court case, kind of the pro-intelligent design communication featured him very heavily because, compared to like a spokesperson for the Discovery Institute, Behe's going to be a much more credible communicator because he's a research professor at a university in this field. So he was a very useful tool for intelligent design proponents in the public arena. Let's see, people haven't talked. Yes?
I've noticed long ago in the media, in print media at least, newspapers, that the daily horoscope will generally appear on the same page as the daily number results and lottery results and predictions. And there's also going to be numerology, generally all in one little place. So it seems to me that perpetuates this mystical thinking for quite a few people. And an even older example is the very revered Farmer's Almanac, and I think that goes back over 200 years. And they're predicting the weather a year ahead, and all other kinds of predictions, when to plant the seeds and pick them up, and all kinds of stuff. So it keeps on rolling along.
Yeah, with the horoscopes and newspapers, there are definitely critics of that, because I was talking earlier about people don't think too hard about things, and they tend to respond to credible cues from people they see as credible. Well, if you think that newspapers are credible, if you're reading a newspaper, it stands to reason you might think the newspapers are credible. The newspaper putting that horoscope in its pages sends this little signal, oh yeah, this is worth putting in a newspaper.
But it's usually with the comics, too.
It's usually with the comics, which would tend to undermine that signal of credibility. But a lot of people do believe in astrology, and some of those people not only believe in it, but believe it's scientific and confuse it with astronomy.
Absolutely.
Yes, in the back.
Just one question. Do you believe
So I have a lot of practice answering this. So this is the answer that I worked up to that. I have not seen or heard or read any evidence that would lead me to conclude that ghosts are real. Now, I always had this dream of, quitting my university job and making a proton pack and going into business as a Ghostbuster. So in a lot of ways, the universe would be cooler if I did believe in ghosts. But so far, nothing has persuaded me that I've never had a paranormal experience. I've never seen evidence, including BIMS, that I thought was compelling evidence of the paranormal. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take like the scientific approach to it, or my question. Just taking a step back, like me not being familiar with paranormal. My question is it not perceived as credible because there might not be any actual facts that can be listed in the paranormal category, whereas like to say one thing is true, like we know that is this amount of energy in this cave always, and we know that this cave might be haunted, so logically the two might coincide. Is there any type of thing that's out there, any type of law or fact?
Yeah, well, with ESP, so one of the things I find interesting about ESP is, of all of these paranormal phenomena, it's the one I think that has carried throughout the last 100 years the most aura of being an actual field of scientific inquiry. So, there are psychologists at Duke University decades ago who were studying this, but from the point of view of the scientific community, if you're studying this and studying this, eventually you expect research papers to be published that present a compelling body of evidence that this actually works. So, with the card tests, if people can read what's on the other side of the card, then you should be able to do controlled experiments where people beat the odds over time. And those studies haven't been published. Now, BIM's study, I don't want to get too far into the arguments of that, but so on some topics, BIM found this small advantage, and one of the criticisms is that if you do enough tests of enough different things enough times, then by the law of probability, you'll find patterns sometimes. So when we talk about statistically significant, what that basically means is it's a measure of uncertainty. And kind of the yardstick in a lot of scientific research is, if it happens, if by the laws of probability you'd expect it to happen only one time out of 20, that's a good benchmark of evidence. But if you do 20 tests, then getting that 1 out of 20 suddenly starts to look less impressive. Let's see. Yes?
I don't mean to pry. I was wondering if you needed funding for the study, and if so, was it hard to get?
So, actually, that's actually a good question, because even kind of social science research on paranormal topics, even if you're not trying to argue that the paranormal is real, if you're just treating it as a subject of inquiry, people's beliefs, there's not a lot of research out there. It's not exactly mainstream. I've got tenure, so I don't have to worry about people being upset that I'm studying this. But I mentioned that students help do it, and so we did it on the cheap. So those research participants, they were part of class projects. And so each student in the class was responsible for getting 20 participants in the study. And so we added them all together, and that gives us a pretty big pool of about 1,500 participants. So I did not get funding for this because I found a way to do it for essentially free.
Do you think the NSF or somebody would fund this, or this would just be, we're not interested in doing this kind of research?
The one area where the NSF is interested in, there's this NSF-funded ongoing project called Indicators of Science. And so the NSF is very interested in what the public thinks about science. And one of the things that project does is it regularly assesses beliefs and perceptions about science, including beliefs about whether pseudoscientific topics are scientific. So they do ask some questions about that. So there is some NSF-funded data on that. And they do have some interest in science communication, but I haven't fired up any grant applications on this yet. Yes, in the very back. Well, it depends. If you argue that your dreams have predictive power, then it's a claim of paranormal phenomena. If you just say, every now and then you happen to have a dream that comes true, then that's not necessarily a paranormal claim, because we tend to dream about things in our daily lives, and by the laws of probability, some of those dreams are going to resemble reality. So a dream coming true isn't necessarily paranormal until you attach explanatory framework to it and say the dreams are somehow reflecting events in the future and that there's a causal relationship there. Yes?
I look at this as sort of this from a historical standpoint. A long time ago, maybe centuries ago, people believed in ESP all the time, or something similar to it. The gods caused the weather and everything else. And as history evolved, science became more able to explain things. And when science became able to explain things, people jumped on science. But the real whole thing goes back to everybody wants to rule the world. They'll use science now because people believe in it, because it can predict things, to push their agenda, whatever it happens to be. And maybe as time goes